I recognized right away that if I did this podcast just by myself, it was going to become on a certain level about myself. I recognized that early on. And that's why I wanted to do it with you, because I didn't want it to be about me. And by having you, I didn't want it to be about us. I wanted it to be about, if you're a survivor, how do you get through this shit? What are the issues? What are the things that screw us up? What are the things that we're dealing with? How have we dealt with it?
You've always held that platform of, I want people to tell their story. You've always cared so much about the other person that you want to give them a place.
Yeah. And it's not us. It's all of us. It's not me and you. It's survivors. This is about survivors. That's what this podcast is about. Not me and you. It's about survivors.
Exactly.
And how do we deal with this shit?
Hi, I'm Lori.
And I'm Kevin, and this is No Longer Ashamed.
We are survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
And we're here to share with you that if you're a survivor, you don't have to be alone.
Our logo is a salamander, and the reason is a fire salamander can survive a fire, and you have survived a fire.
We want to help you with your journey to healing and hope.
We are all survivors together, and we walk this journey together, and you are not alone.
By telling our stories, we are hoping that you will have the courage to share your stories as well and find your voice.
Because stories are so important, and for so long I know that I wouldn't tell my story, but when I finally shared my story, that's when I got my freedom.
And this is our journey and your journey to healing and hope. So come with us.
So 3 years. So we've learned how important our story is. And I think we were kind of blown away because we knew that we wanted to provide a place, but the things that we've seen happen when people do tell their stories has been amazing.
Yeah, I believe it's a lot to do with overcoming the fear and the shame. And of course, I know it was for me. And what happens is you realize that your life doesn't end, or, it doesn't get drastically worse. Instead, it gets better because you've taken the courage to talk about it and taken that step to acknowledge what happened to you. And once you realize you do have the courage to talk about it, that it breaks through the fear and the shame, and you realize that it wasn't your fault and you don't deserve what happened and you don't deserve all the effects. That's a huge part of it, I think, is just realizing it's so important to talk about it because it gives other people the chance to acknowledge or talk about what has happened to them.
And also some people shared their story for the first time, or while sharing their story, they shared an element of something new for the first time. And the freedom they felt after doing that was amazing.
Yeah. Even I realized, I've had breakthroughs during the different episodes of just getting deeper and deeper. And that's changed my perspective and changed, how I've dealt with things. And the main part of that is getting to the reasons we hide it from ourselves. I think for me was a big thing. I think when we're hiding it from others, we're also trying to hide it from ourselves, certain parts of it. And there's certain things we just think we just can't go there. You just can't bring that up. And then once you start talking about it, you realize that it's not going to wreck your life. Instead, it gives you courage. It gives you strength. It gives you the willpower to make changes in your life.
When Nathan shared his story, Toy Cars, I remember he had just such a strong sense of, I will never tell anybody, because it was as though if he did, first they wouldn't believe him. He had been so manipulated by the abuser. But also that by telling it, people would think differently of him. And he didn't want people to think of him in that light.
Yeah.
So he sort of made that decision. And so what's been amazing is when people do tell their story and they get the reaction and the validation they never expected, it gives them the courage. And then they recognize, it's almost like as adults, when you recognize you were abused as a child, you don't see yourself as that child. You see yourself as the adult. And so when people respond in the proper ways, horrified, oh my goodness, that never should have happened to you. You were just a child.
Yeah.
It sort of opens up your eyes to go, oh, wait a minute. The story I've been telling myself, I should have fought them off. I should have known better. And even our friend Julie, who was sex trafficked, admitted on our show that her dad had abused her. And she said, I thought it was my fault. I thought somehow maybe I had flirted with him, that I had brought this on as a little girl.
Yeah.
Right. Because when you remember as an adult, you see yourself as an adult. So I think that's what's been really powerful too in what we've been discovering with these podcasts.
Yeah. Is how once you start talking about, you realize more and more that there's all these voices or lies or, stories that we were taught. What we were taught wasn't the truth, and that when we talk about it, we actually get to see it through other people's eyes. And because of that, it gives you the chance to look at, like, if someone you knew at that age, this had happened to them, how would you feel about it? So you realize people do want to be supportive. They're not going to judge you. They're not going to be shaming you like you do. And you realize you're treating yourself like shit, basically, because we beat ourselves up so badly for what happened to us, because that's basically how we were taught almost. And we were taught that we were trash or whatever, all these things that we were taught. And so by talking about it, we realized that wasn't true. And at the same time, I think survivors in a way come out of talking about it stronger than in a lot of ways, than because you get that bravery. You realize by having the courage to talk about it, you're supporting yourself, you're backing yourself up, you're taking care of yourself. And that gives you this strength that you didn't have before.
Yeah. Also, what I think we've learned is when people tell their story, that they then recognize there is help. Like sometimes before they share their story, they don't ever want to get counseling because they think they're okay. But when they tell their story, they recognize that, oh, it's okay to get support, to get healing. And I love that quote by Alex L. Self-healing is an act of community service. And that when we go to coaching, counseling, we work on healing ourselves. We treat our families better. We treat our communities better. But often when we're still in the victim role, we're behaving badly because we're behaving like a victim. We're behaving as though we have no control over our behaviors. Maybe we're triggered and we're lashing out and treating our family badly. But when we get help, then we recognize those things and then we behave better.
Yeah. And by telling your story, you're also giving yourself the reason for getting help. It's so hard for some people to get help, for men especially. And I know men just don't want to admit they need help. But by admitting this happened to us when we were a kid, that little kid needs help. And even just saying that out loud makes me feel this kind of a sense of shame, because men just don't act like that. But when you have the courage to share your story, when you have the courage to talk about it and say, this happened to me, this was messed up, this was wrong, and I deserve to get some sort of help about this, and it's not shameful or embarrassing, because in order to take care of myself, I need to take care of these issues. And if I don't take care of these issues, I'm not taking care of those, the people I live with, my wife, my family, my kids. If I don't take care of myself, I'm not going to be taking very good care of them, because I'm going to have these issues that I'm not dealing with, and it's going to affect them. So we acknowledge that we're worth going to get help. And that's a big step for me, was acknowledging that I was worth getting help. And I think that comes from talking about it.
Yeah. And the whole self-care aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, recognizing that I do need to find out not only what the issues are, but also find out the ways that help me when I need, just to take care of myself because something's triggered me or I'm stressed out or haven't been, I've just been overworking myself or not getting enough sleep. Those ways that you have to find to recover, to have restoration. And a lot of it has to do with giving yourself the opportunity to heal, recognizing that we're worth getting healing.
Mm-hmm. And that going to a counselor doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It means something's right with you. And you're going to learn how you're going to get validated and you're going to get all the support and things that you need. And I know there was a couple times where people would say, I tried counseling, it didn't work. And you and I are always like, make sure you have a trauma-informed counselor.
Yeah.
Right. You want to get a counselor that knows how to counsel someone who's been through this kind of trauma.
Well, and if it didn't work for you, think about why it didn't work for you. There could be lots of different reasons. It might not be a counselor you were comfortable with, or you just weren't interested in what they were talking about or asking you, and there's also other techniques. There's the EMDR, there's so many techniques for dealing with trauma, and maybe the counselor you were going to wasn't familiar with some of these techniques that you could be using that can help you with your trauma, because there's so much more now than there was before. We're recognizing how trauma affects us in our brains. Even just like with addiction, we're recognizing that it's not just drugs, alcohol, tobacco, it's other things. It's gambling, it's pornography, it's all these things and how they're affecting our brain. And what that does to us to make us addicted. And then how do you get out of that cycle? There's so much more knowledge now of how trauma and how it, addiction, all these things, how it affects us, and getting the help you need. We do have to recognize that what happened to us, we didn't deserve. It wasn't our fault. We shouldn't be ashamed about it. But there's issues we have, and we shouldn't be ashamed about them either. But we need to take care of them. We need to address those issues so we can function healthy.
Well, and here's the thing is we don't need to.
Yeah.
People always say, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. And we don't need to. And that's the problem is a lot of people don't. But when we get to that place of want to, when we get to the place where the pain is worse than the, not doing something about it is worse, then we get that freedom, and it's always a choice that when we're ready, and that it's like being brave enough to take that step. And if you didn't like your counselor or it didn't work out, or maybe they were one that hijacked, there's counselors that will hijack the conversation and make it about them. Like not every counselor is a good counselor. So, it's like you can try again. You can keep being brave. You can keep working towards it. And I think the other thing we really learned is that we might always be triggered on some level. Like we don't just go and get well.
Yeah.
It's a journey and it's a process, and there are different levels of being triggered, and that, just because we're getting well doesn't mean we won't be triggered, but when we get triggered doesn't mean we're not well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the big difference is how we react when we're triggered. And that's why it's so important to get the help that we need or want, get the help that we deserve, actually.
That's it.
And because we do get triggered, you can't really make the triggers go away. You can recognize them, you can be aware of them, you can know when to expect them in some cases, not always, but some. I mean,
a lot of times it's, oh, I got triggered. Oh, now I recognize something happened. It's like it's the after, but at least you're at a point where you can at least recognize that's what's happening.
Yeah. But I mean, in some of the triggers I used to have don't trigger me as much because I just recognized them and I knew they were triggers and I acknowledged them, and now I prepare myself for them. Like for a long time, male doctors, male barbers, male dentists, all that stuff. Anytime I had someone that was cutting my hair that was right there in my face, or a doctor, totally freaked me out. It still does, but I know what to expect. So I've had to have male doctors recently, and I knew it was going to be difficult. And because I knew that and basically prepared myself for it, it wasn't as difficult as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I still avoid it when I can because it is a trigger. But
Yeah.
if it's something that it's necessary to do, I can deal with it. And that's a big part of this is learning that you can deal with your triggers
Well,
in a
and
healthy
I
way.
yeah, I think that's so good because there are going to be some things that might always be hard. So for
Hmm.
me, walking outside alone on the street is just really hard for me. And I think it was because of things that happened when I was a kid. You're very vulnerable. Somebody can pick you up, things like
Hmm.
that. And so even though I've done a lot of work, if I can go swim every day versus walking around my neighborhood. Not that I'm not going to walk around my neighborhood, but for me, it's just a constant hypervigilance. I'm constantly looking around. I can't just
Hmm.
relax. And so it's like when you recognize what things trigger you, you can have good boundaries around them. And yeah, we want to overcome as much as we can, but we also don't have to torture ourselves.
Yeah. So that's part of what becoming more aware of our issues, how it helps. And again, that all starts with just being able to talk about it with someone, being able to bring it up.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to bring up too about when we think about what we've learned in 3 years, something that I think was really powerful for both you and I is when we really recognized how people were saying my abuser, my trafficker,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
how important it is not to give them that power and to say the person who abused me
Yeah. Yeah.
rather
The
than saying,
language we use. And
yeah,
that came up when we interviewed Daniel.
Daniel.
And he was very specific about that. And then we realized, oh, I've probably said that before. I probably still say that sometimes. And I'm more aware of it now.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that became a big thing because after that, when we heard people saying that sometimes in some of the interviews, we were like, you almost want to correct them.
Yeah,
And we
because
realized the language does has a powerful effect on how we treat ourselves in a way.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that I remember us kind of being like, wow, really blown away by that. But also with this new podcast I'm doing, I've asked people to use I language because
Hmm.
what I've recognized when we tell our story. So when I tell my story, if I say, so this morning I was editing something for someone and they said, when you read the Bible and you find this scripture and you wonder what God is thinking. And I was listening to this as I was editing it. And I thought if this person would say, when I read the scripture and I saw that verse and I wondered what God was doing, because what happens is when we tell our story with you, number one, it separates the teller of the story from the story because you're not saying, I felt this way. But the listener, if they didn't feel that way, then they don't feel like they belong and they're going to tune out, back off rather than lean in. And so
Hmm.
even in telling our story, owning, and in the beginning, it's hard and you and I never correct anyone ever.
Hmm.
But as people, so we think about our friend Mike, he's been on so many podcasts now and he's really polishing his story. And as you tell your story, and as I tell my story, I tell it in a way that it's my story. So if someone can relate to it, they can make a decision about it rather than me saying, well, when you do this, you get
Yeah.
this, and then this will happen. You'll get this outcome. Because just because I had that outcome doesn't mean someone else will. But if I say, I did this, I had this outcome, then they can decide and they can have hope. And
Hmm.
so it's been really interesting for me to see that phenomenon. And as a person who listens all day, every day to people in interviews, because that's all my jobs, is I can feel really assaulted by people's stories when they start using their story to tell me what to do.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's been really interesting. Our people don't do that. We don't see that.
Uh-huh.
But just recognizing, I've really noticed more when people own their story and say, I.
Yeah. And also, as Daniel was saying, not owning the abuse by calling the perpetrator my abuser,
Right.
because by saying that, you're you're placing a ownership on that by saying it was mine, it was my abuser.
Right.
And so when we separate ourselves from that, then we realize that we were perpetrated upon when someone, the abuse, the abuser, the person that abused me,
Yeah.
so that's an important distinction in our head. And we've also learned that we can change our brains by the way we speak, by the things we say to ourselves. We can change how we see things that happen to us by speaking them. But it takes speaking them and acknowledging that and repeating that over and over. And especially at those times when we're hearing those tapes in our heads that are lies, those lies that we've been taught. When we hear those, we've got to repute them and repeat the truth in our brains and teach our brains to see it from a perspective differently.
Right. The Bible says, take every thought captive. And the thing that for me that has been pretty amazing is before I told my story, I believed a certain thing because I never said the words. Mm-hmm. So I believed it was my fault. Mm-hmm. If I wasn't so ... But then when I got a counselor and I shared my story, all of a sudden I could then recognize, oh, that's not a true story. I could recognize it, and then I could begin to change the words. But until we have the words for it, then we're just in our back of our mind telling our brain, it's your fault. You shouldn't have done this. As a victim, we say all these things. But then when we speak the words, we say our story, just what you were saying, we speak our truth, then we can start to discern it and we'll catch ourselves. We may even say, oh, well, it was my fault. We hear people who are in abusive relationships say, well, I provoked him. Or I provoked her. And right, it's a story they're telling themselves because we're not responsible for other people's actions.
It was my fault because I did this and that made them angry. And because of that, it was my fault because I was acting a certain way. Or, all the things we've been taught. But by speaking the truth and looking at it from an adult at the child that we were or at the person that we were. One of the other things I think we've learned in these years is why it's so important to talk about. Partly one of the biggest things is to give others a chance to acknowledge our stories and then acknowledge that it's okay to talk about. So they start to talk about. You're giving them a space. You're giving them a feeling of belonging because, I mean, there are 1 in 5 people practically that have been abused. And so you know someone who's been abused. And how many people have you heard talk about it? Not any, probably, or very few. But when you talk about it, you give them the space to talk about it. And we've found that so many times. I've found it just by talking about my podcast. People have talked to me about their issues and their abuse. And there's actually someone who might be a featured guest that has talked to me about it, that I don't think he would have ever brought it up otherwise. I mean, how often do you talk about this stuff? So when we do talk about it, it gives people the opportunity and it counters the bullshit out there. It counters the lies. It counters the stigma. Stigma comes from the bullshit. And we've heard from someone recently about people who are very famous podcasters who are talking about sexual abuse in a way that isn't truthful. And we know it isn't truthful because we're survivors and we get it. But they are they're continuing the stigma. And the only way to counter the stigma is to bring the truth, to talk about the truth of what it's like to be a survivor. There was a guy, a very famous podcaster, talking about how if you're abused, you're going to be an abuser. It's like being a vampire. Once you're bitten, you become one. That kind of bullshit. He also talked about how if a boy is abused, a young boy is abused by an older woman, it's not abuse, especially if he liked it, it's not bad. And he's talking about like a 10, 11, 12-year-old boy, a child. So
he's calling it a rite of passage, basically.
Yes, he's basically making this macho rite of passage thing. And we've talked to men who were abused by women when they were kids. I was abused by an older woman when I was a kid, and it wasn't okay. It was abuse. It traumatized me. It traumatized those men.
Yeah.
that kind of bullshit, we have to counter it with the truth. And the only way
Exactly.
we do that is by talking about it.
Right. I think of Avreme. Remember that?
Yes, yes. He was
His,
abused by a babysitter
yep. And he did,
or nanny. Nanny?
yep. Well,
Yeah.
same thing. He didn't want to tell anyone. And he finally did go to counseling and he finally did take her to court and he won. And it is appalling to me. I remember early on when in my recovery, when people on the news, like a mass murderer or a kidnapper, they would always say, well, they were abused as a child.
Yeah,
That's why
that was their
they,
excuse, or
right,
they would just basically say, "Of course that
right.
happened."
And the truth is, I just listened to this amazing book about this FBI agent that did a study on serial killers, and most serial killers, if they're born with as a psychopath, if they're born that way and they're not triggered, they may never do the really bad things. But if you are born with the gene and you have trauma, it can trigger you to start doing those things. But often the trauma is abuse. And so
Mm,
even in that, this guy talked about how almost every person who has done terrible, awful things was abused, but not everyone who is abused does terrible, awful
yeah,
things.
yeah. It's kind of the trigger that leads towards it for some people, but those are the very few exception. Those are the ones that tend to be sociopathic. I mean, like you said, you can be sociopathic and not act it out, but
Right.
the trauma triggers it and you act out.
Yeah.
But that's very few of the actual survivors. I mean, again, 1 in 5 people are probably survivors.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know,
Right.
you probably don't know anyone who's a sociopath,
Right.
but people just perpetuate this stigma. And the way we get around that, the way we get past that is to talk about, to say,
Right.
no, that's bullshit. Not everyone who's
Right.
a survivor is going to be a perpetrator because I'm, an example of not being a perpetrator and
Right.
I'm a survivor. So call bullshit on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the statistics comes from because there's a huge percentage of men in prison that were abused. So
Hmm.
they're going, oh, well, all these men, 95%, that's not really the statistic. I don't know it, but
Yeah, we don't know because they don't actually keep track of it. It's
well,
hard
and they
to.
don't know it. Like even our
Uh-huh.
friend Dan, that was on one of our first podcasts, he had gone to prison and everything, and he still had never told anyone
Yeah, exactly.
what had
They
happened.
or they won't acknowledge it. I mean, if you're in prison, you're not going to acknowledge that you were abused because you're putting yourself out there as a victim, or at least
Mm-hmm.
that's what you think.
Yeah.
But a lot of men do end up in prison because of abuse, because the ways we cope.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean everyone who's
Right.
been abused ends up in prison. There's a lot of survivors that just go the opposite way. They become ultra performers. And we've talked about people that they go the opposite direction. They overperform. They do this because
Yeah.
they're trying to
Start
overcome it.
foundations. Yeah.
They're trying to overcome it in another way. And for men, they become super macho. They become bodybuilders. They become, martial arts stuff because they're trying to say that'll never happen to me again.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, it is so much bigger than people realize. And when, like you said, if 1 in 5, and we don't even know that to be true because people don't open up about it. So if everybody really did share their story, it's probably a lot more kids that are abused than we originally think. But that, we don't want to normalize it in a way of like, well, that happens to kids, but we also want to say it happens. So let's talk about it and let's get the healing. Let's move on and live the life that you were always intended to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the importance of this is we need a lot more support for all these survivors.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the greatest mental health care in our country.
In our state. Washington State is one of the worst.
And
you know that, right?
Yeah, and we're not addressing this the way we should. We're not taking it as seriously as we should. And there's a lot of work we could be doing better. But I think another thing we have found in our 3 years of doing this is things are starting to change. People are starting to acknowledge this, and it's becoming easier or more acceptable to say something. And because of that, I think the tide is kind of turning. We're realizing that, yes, a lot of people do need mental health support. A lot of people do need to have a way of dealing with these issues that's healthy. A lot of people should be able to talk about this and not feel the stigma, not feel the shame, and not feel bad about getting help to deal with these issues.
Right. And there's a certain level of brainwashing that can go on that makes it hard to give yourself permission to get
Mm-hmm.
help. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I finally went to a counselor, my family was furious,
Mm, really?
furious, and I didn't understand. Well, they were going to
Oh,
get found out.
yeah, and I think there's still pushback, but it is getting better. It is
Mhm.
getting better, and I'm thankful for that. I wish there was more in place to support and to recognize, and especially for men in prisons, in, mental health crisis, if we could acknowledge that men need to recognize and not feel bad about what happened to them. So many men just don't want to talk about it because they feel bad about what happened to them.
Or they feel shame, like somehow it shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Somehow it shouldn't, and it shouldn't have happened to them. But it's that shame of I was maybe in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe I caused it, and that's where it gets really difficult. But we've heard several podcasters, several famous musicians that have finally come out and told their story and the freedom they've gotten by choosing to walk this journey and get the support and help has been incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Marcus Mumford, that album he just came out with, which is,
Yeah.
well, not just, it's been a few years now, but it's so incredible. And I just love it because I feel supported by listening to that album. It just makes me feel like, yes, someone else who's gone through this is talking about it, is
Mm-hmm.
making it, bringing it out to as many people as he can.
Right. It's not like you're glad they went through it, but you also
No,
go, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one.
yeah. And if you're listening to this, you aren't the only one. You shouldn't be alone because there are, ways to get help. There's places to get support. There's people like you that have been through it that will be willing to talk about it with you. There's people like you that know what you're going through and want to help you get beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's
Well, and also the other thing that we've learned too is that until you tell your story and you begin the journey of healing, it's really hard to have boundaries because your boundaries have been so crossed that it's really hard to understand that you have a right to your
mm,
body and to say no, like you don't know. And so it sets you up for further abuse as you grow up because you're never taught that you can have good boundaries. And so that is the one thing too that I think people begin to get in their journey right away of healing is, oh, wait, you mean I can say no? I don't have to let everyone have access.
hmm I think there's been several people that recognize that because of what they'd been through, they just accepted that as that they were just an object. They were just there to
Yeah.
please others. They were there just to be used. And that's all they would ever be. That's all. They couldn't get past that
Mm-hmm.
until you say, no, this was wrong. Then you're just letting it continue because you don't know anything else.
Yeah. It's like, wow, what a novel idea.
Yeah, yeah. But not everyone who's in, I mean, I think once you're trapped also and you don't see a way out, I think it's important to recognize that there is help. I think for some people, when they're being abused, they don't know that there is actually help. They don't know where to find help. So
Yeah.
I think it's
especially when it's happening in your own family, because you just think this must be normal. Like you don't know that it's supposed to be different.
Well, yeah, and also you don't know who else you can turn to,
Yeah,
who you can tell that this is happening to you, who you can
right.
trust.
And if you do tell, you might lose your whole family.
Yeah.
Didn't we have someone on like that they were like, oh, if I tell, they're going to break up our whole family, put us in foster care. Like, so there's a lot of weight that goes with that too for a child to carry.
I'm just thinking about so many stories we've had, and one of the other issues that I think, or one of the other big milestones for people, I think we've heard through the stories, is recognizing that forgiveness isn't about forgiving the person that did this to you, isn't about doing anything for them. It's not for them at all. It's for yourself. That was the biggest thing. Everyone that's come to that point of forgiveness has recognized forgiveness is self-healing. It's not
Letting them off the
letting
hook.
them off the hook, giving them anything. It's not, you're not doing it for them. You're doing it for yourself by
Right.
forgiving them. And when they learned that, and when they got to that place of forgiveness, every one of it seemed universal that it was this load that was dropped, this weight that was dropped off of them. Remember, we've heard that so many times. Just all of a sudden, I felt like this weight was lifted off me. And that's when they recognized that forgiveness is a part of self-healing.
Right.
It brings yourself to a point of you're not being burdened. I know that's how I felt, was I didn't have to have this burden anymore of punishing or wanting to punish that person, or holding a grudge, or I wasn't holding on to it.
Yeah.
That's the big thing.
I think I
You
remember
let
someone
go of
saying they
it.
had thought about it every day. They had thought about the person who abused them every single day, and they recognized this person hasn't thought about me in 40 years or however many years.
Yeah,
And they
exactly.
recognized, oh, they were the one keeping it alive by holding on to it rather than letting go.
We're holding on. We're just gripping it tightly.
Yeah.
And suddenly, after we forgive, we're not clenched up anymore. We released it. That weight is dropped. And so that's the important thing we've learned about forgiveness, is it's not about the perpetrator. It's not for them at all necessarily. It's for ourselves. It's for our own self-healing.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if we're waiting for an apology, the likeliness of that is very low.
And even getting that apology, if we don't forgive them, if we're still holding it against them, we're the ones holding on to it still.
Right.
So, those are the biggies. And they're all huge, all the stuff we've been learning in these 3 years.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this is going to be a education, but it has been.
Mm-hmm. And I think even as we've done these podcasts and listened to these stories, we've had to be really good about self-care, because when we hear the stories, they do affect us, because our heart hurts for those people. And so I love it that we recognize how important it is that we still take good care of ourselves while we provide this platform.
And are still open to learning about ourselves, because it's been a learning process. I did not realize it would be such an eye-opener, and just to myself and to everyone we've talked with. It's been amazing.
Yeah. And just the ripple effect of abuse and the power it has over generations of families, and that we have the power in ourselves to stop that cycle. I heard this story about people who were children of people that were in the Holocaust, the secondhand trauma. So when we don't get the help and get the support we need, even though our kids aren't being abused at all by us, they're still getting secondhand trauma, because there are things that emote from us because of our unworthiness or our shame that bleeds on to them.
our unresolved issues.
Yeah. So when we do the work, we can change our family and our family history.
Yeah, we can break the cycle, and that's the whole point. I
Mhm.
mean, besides just getting help for ourselves, and that's why that quote, self-healing is a self
Active community
act of
service.
community service. It is. And that's for everyone else we know.
Right.
So if we want to get healthy, we're going to have an effect on everyone we know.
Right. And we will be more effective when we hear of somebody in our family or somebody we know, we hear that something has happened. If we're not working on ourselves, we'll just get triggered and go into numbing. But if we've been doing our work, we might get triggered, but we're able to actually help the people we love because it doesn't spin us out of control because we are doing our work. So we're so much more effective at helping others.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and if we're so busy hiding it when it happens to someone else, then how do we deal with it? If
Right.
you're just too busy bottling it up,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to deal with it in a healthy way.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, we have learned a lot in 3 years for sure.
But the main thing, which has been the theme from day one, is share your story. Find a safe place, find a safe person, find someone who you trust and who is going to listen to you and acknowledge your story and share it, talk
Mm-hmm.
about it, bring it up. And that's the starting step to recognizing your issues and getting the help you deserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. The help you deserve
Yeah.
because you deserve freedom. You deserve love. You deserve the life that you want. And often I know for me, until I was able to talk about it, I don't even think I was able to really pursue my dreams because I had such unworthiness and shame. And I always thought if I do the thing I want to do, people will find out.
Yeah.
Rather than going, oh, I have the power. I can actually tell my story. So it doesn't matter if anybody finds out.
Yeah, you're taking power over what happened to you rather than it's having power over you. You're
Yeah.
taking power over it. You're
Right.
taking control of it
Yeah.
rather than it controlling your life.
Something that I think is that we learned too is people thought things about themselves. Like we had a lot of men that thought maybe they were gay. Like people thought things about themselves until they got help because they
Yeah.
didn't know.
When Doug talked about, and it wasn't stimulation and attraction, we talked about this a lot, and it's so important because especially for men,
Yeah.
it's one thing to get stimulated and it's another thing to have desire. That was it. The difference between stimulation and desire, and how when we're young, when we're children, we don't recognize that there's a difference. So when we're stimulated by being abused, we don't recognize that. We think that's desire on our part because our body reacts in a certain way. And
Yeah.
because of that, we think that is something we wanted because it reacts in a way that's stimulating. But there's a difference between what that stimulation and what we actually desire, but we get screwed up. It gets scrambled when we're children, when we're young, and
Yeah.
when we're being abused and we're being stimulated, and we don't realize that's not necessarily what we desire. That
Right.
isn't what we desire, but we don't realize that because of the stimulation. So the difference between stimulation and desire and what that means to us as we're young and we don't know the difference, how
It
it
can be so confusing.
yeah, because if you think the abuse stimulated you and you feel like guilty because of that stimulation, or you feel like, oh, it wasn't abuse because of that stimulation. And that's where that guy who was talking about how if a young boy, 10, 11, 12-year-old boy is being abused by an older woman, it's okay because they liked it. Well, no, they were stimulated by it. But that wasn't okay because that messed them up. That wasn't what they desired. When you're 10 or 11 or 12 years old, you can't consent to sex. That's not right because you're too young to consent.
Right.
Don't recognize that sex isn't right when have an older woman abusing you just because you were stimulated by it, or even an older man who abuses you and you're stimulated by it.
I really hope he got called out on that.
I don't know. He's so famous. I don't know and his podcast, of course, is geared about, being this manly man type crap. And so I think at the time he talked about, the people he was talking with, of course, felt the same way or agreed about it because, and that's part of the stigma that we have to, that is wrong, but isn't recognized as wrong by certain people because they that's all they've heard.
And what is it that's making him want to defend it so much? That's what really, but I won't go there.
Yeah, I know. So there's so many reasons it's important to tell our stories.
Yeah. And to speak up. I know that there's been people who have said, well, this happened to me, but it wasn't like rape. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Abuse is abuse.
Yeah.
Right. That we just keep speaking up.
Yeah. It wasn't that bad. Or
How many times have we heard that?
And I think what Doug Carpenter talked about, the difference between stimulation and desire, is huge. And I think that's part of the myth. And that's where a lot of the stigma comes, is because there's this, people think men think if they were stimulated, it was okay.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So, Will, congratulations to us on 3 years,
3 years
of
and,
podcasting through COVID.
And so many people we've met that their stories are so amazing, so important, so heartbreaking so many times. But what's amazing is their strength and their bravery and their courage to overcome and become not just survivors, but thrivers, to, recognize that what happened to them wasn't right. And now they're taking care of themselves. It's been really inspiring, and to see some of the people keep, the things they're doing now because they want to help others.
Yeah. Which I think that's what we all really want to do, is help others.
As we get our healing, we're reaching back. We want to bring someone along with us. So, and on that note. So that's it for today.
We are going to have a prayer time if you want to stick with us. If not, we believe in you.
We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories.
If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find us. And we really want to spread this message.
Father, I thank you for all your blessings, especially for all you've been teaching us these years of doing our podcast with the people who have been so brave, so courageous, so open to sharing their stories and open to the wounds they've had and their vulnerabilities, but showing the bravery they have to come forward with it and actually acknowledge it. And I just am thankful for the work you are doing in their lives and the amazing healing they've had. And I just pray that you would continue to bless them and be present in their lives, and also to be present in the lives of those who are listening, and to bless them with your acceptance and persistence in their lives and the love you have for them, no matter what they've been through, no matter how they feel about themselves, no matter how ashamed or how worthless they feel. If they feel like they don't deserve your love, you know that they deserve your love and you love them no matter what. And Lord, I just pray they would feel that love in their lives right now, and to feel lifted up by you, and that you want to be there with them and help them on this journey of healing. In your name I pray.
And Father, I pray that as we continue this podcast, we'll continue our learning. We'll be open to whatever it is that you have for us, that we can continue myth busting and exposing the stigma and helping people know that they're not alone and that there is help and support. And I thank you that we can be victorious, that we don't have to remain victims. I thank you that there is help. I thank you that there's freedom. And like what Kevin said about people who talk about forgiveness and how when they do that, the burden is lifted and their life gets better. And I just pray that we will remember that every day, even in the little things that we want to hold grudges and be angry, that we will just embrace forgiveness in every area of our life. I thank you that you are a good God and that you love us and you want good things for us. In your Son's holy name, amen.